doors and let the music play. Let's let the streets resound with singing.
Chapter 6 in Revelation. Chapter 6. And chapter 6 is usually the place where people, when they read Revelation, they start to feel uncomfortable. Okay, that's because there's wars, and there's famines, and people die, and there's martyrs. It's kind of that word we don't like to use very often, in public, martyrs. And so we kind of wonder, is that going to happen in our lifetime? Is that going to happen to me? Am I going to be one of the martyrs? And everybody gets kind of nervous. In fact, some people, I can think back to John Calvin and Martin Luther, they didn't think the book of Revelation should even be in the New Testament. It made them too nervous. In fact, to this day, the Eastern Orthodox Church will not read the book of Revelation in public. So it does make a lot of people really nervous when we come to Revelation. But actually, I think if Revelation were not in the New Testament, I would be more nervous. And that's because it tells us how everything turns out. Can you imagine if Revelation wasn't there? I mean, we would know that Jesus died for us, but then, okay, how does the world end after that? What happens? Revelation is the one that tells us all that. We wouldn't know that otherwise. Actually, I'm going to move out of the way here a little bit so you can see without me standing there. So anyway, it does make people nervous. It is a little strange. It is a little weird. It is a little hard to understand. But there's a reason for all that. It tells the story of the battle between good and evil, and in the end, Jesus wins. And that's what we need to know. Now, when it comes to Revelation, there's a lot of different views, interpretation about the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. You might have a different view than I do. That's okay. I'm not saying you're wrong and I'm right. But we do need to understand the different views in Revelation. I have changed my view over the years. The last time I taught this was 4 years ago, and some of my thinking has changed since then about Revelation. So it's okay to make changes, when that seems an appropriate thing to do. And I don't want to give you the impression that what I'm teaching is my own ideas. Some of this stuff, in fact, everything, I'm not that smart, actually, to be honest with you. But I look at what other people have taught, what other Bible teachers have taught, scholars have taught, and I look to see, am I in line with what they're saying, or am I really out of line? Because I don't want to teach something that's off base or is some new kind of thing, but no one's ever heard of before. So I really try to fit in with what other people have done. And I think I've probably said this before, I don't think there is a Bible teacher alive who teaches the book of Revelation 100% correctly. Now that may scare a few of you, but I really don't think there is. Revelation is difficult to understand. Some of it we can, some of it we're not sure. And maybe as it gets closer to the time when Jesus returns, we'll have better understanding about things. But I do think we can understand some things. And so my attempt is to try to get as close to as 100% as I can, but realizing that I am not 100% correct in what I teach you. So, having said all of that, let's go to the next slide here. Revelation is a series of threes. You can see up there. First you have the seals, and you'll notice the first four, the horses there, are kind of set together. And then that is followed by the next two that are kind of together. And then that last one, number 7, that's by itself. And you'll notice for each of those, the trumpet's the same thing. There's 4 that are together, then 2, and then 1, and the same with the bowls there. And what you will notice is that number 7, I think, is identical in the same event for all of those. So number 7 for the 7th seal is the same as the 7th trumpet, which is the same as the 7th bowl. That's when Jesus returns. That's when judgment takes place. And so that's just to give you an overview of some things there. And this is what Bible scholars have noticed, how 4 of them kind of fit together, and then 2 fit together, and then there's that last one by itself there. Now, when we come to Revelation, there's a couple questions that people ask. The first question is, when do these events take place? Have they already happened? Are they some point in the future? And when most people read Revelation, they probably read it as if it's describing something maybe in the future. They're not really sure. And I think it does apply to the future, definitely, but I think it also applies to the past and to the present. I think what we see happening there is past, present, and future. In my opinion, the seals, trumpets, and bowls are describing history from the first coming of Christ till the second coming of Christ. Everything in between there is all right up there in the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. Okay, next slide. Now, there's basically three ways to understand the seals, trumpets, and bowls. The first view we could call the successive view. And with this view, everything happens in sequence, in order. And if this is correct, then there are 21 different events that are taking place with a couple of interruptions in between there. And so chapters 6 through 19 would be chronological and mostly literal. And then the second view is the simultaneous view. Now, according to this view, the seals, trumpets, and bowls are three ways of viewing the same event. So John would be telling the same story three times, but from a different perspective. And maybe each time adding a little bit more detail than he did before. Now, this isn't as strange as it seems, because this is actually how the Gospels are written, all four Gospels. They're from a perspective of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Some of the events are the same, but sometimes more details are added. For example, Mark talks about in Mark chapter 5 the story of the demon-possessed man who has a legion of demons. Jesus casts them out. They go into the herd of pigs, and they all run down the cliff and die. Well, in Matthew's account, there's not one demon-possessed man, there's two. Who's right? Who's wrong? Well, they're both right. Matthew just gives a little more detail. And there are other events like that in the Gospels that have a little more detail to it than what somebody else did, and they come at it from a different perspective. So this really isn't unusual, and I tend to think this is the way that Revelation is done, with the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. Maybe another way to look at it is like a video. You watch a video and you're seeing the same event but from different angles. So let me explain it this way. You watch a football game. Somebody scores a goal, right? Then what do? They show a repeat of that goal, but maybe from a different angle. They show how this angle looks when the person scores, then there's another angle there how the person scores. It's the same event, but you're looking at it from a different perspective each time. So that's what I kind of think is happening with Revelation there, and that's why I like that kind of view, simultaneous view. Then we have a third view, which is the successive, speeded simultaneous view, and the key to understanding this is the results. The seals destroy 1/4 of the earth, and the trumpets 1/3 of the earth, and then the bowls destroy 1/2, or everything else that remains outside of that. And these things get more severe as time goes along, and they seem to accelerate. So it kind of looks like the seals could take maybe centuries, but then when you get to the trumpets and the bowls, maybe they're months or even days. That's what some people think. So, and what is interesting, as I said before, is that seventh seal, the seventh trumpet, and the seventh bowl, they seem to be identical. And they each have a major earthquake followed by the second coming. Okay, next slide. So I don't know if you can see all of that. That's kind of a comparison there of the same event. You'll notice there's a great earthquake with each one. There's voices, thunderings, lightnings, that type of thing. And there's a little more detail added sometimes. But basically, it's talking about the second coming of Christ and judgment that's going to be happening. Now, those who hold to the successive view tend to take each event literally. Now, so think about this. You can see number 4 there, every mountain and island taken out of the way. Okay, then the 7th bowl, every island fled away, the mountains were not found. If those really are successive and they're different events, how can that happen twice? How can islands and mountains be removed? They don't grow back. And so it seems to me the only logical answer would be that it has to be the same event that it's being talked about right there. So those are 3 possible ways of understanding the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. Now, some people ask, have any of the seals been opened yet? And my answer would be, I think they've all been opened. I think every single one has been opened. Jesus was found worthy to open the seals in the 1st century. Why does he have to wait 2,000 or more years before he opens them? He's already been found worthy. And I think according to John, he opened the seals already. They're done. All that we're waiting for is for him to return. That's all that we're waiting for right now. The gospel has to be preached to all the nations, and then the end will come. And that hasn't happened yet. Another question that we have to ask is, how do we interpret these events? Because how you interpret them will determine what you believe about some of those things. In other words, do we take them literally or do we take them symbolically? Now, the Bible itself never says how it should be interpreted. It kind of leaves it up to us to decide how best to do that. And I think most of the New Testament should be interpreted literally, particularly with the Gospels, Acts, the letters that are written. They all fit better when you interpret them literally, but Revelation is a little bit different. Revelation is apocalyptic literature, which is a different kind of genre, and there is a lot of symbolism within that. The book of Daniel in the Old Testament is the same thing. Some of the prophets, the same thing about that. So John is using metaphors here to communicate what he sees. And he thinks that if we can picture it in our mind, we will understand it better. And sometimes John just doesn't have the right words to use to explain what's going on. And so he thinks of an image or something. He says, oh, this kind of tells what it's about here. And so he gives us that, which is the best that he can do. He just doesn't have the right language to use for that. And you really cannot interpret everything in Revelation literally. Most everybody would agree with that. For example, is Jesus really a lamb? Well, he's not really a lamb. A lamb is symbolism. It's used for being powerless and being weak, and that's what the meaning is behind that. John, I think, probably actually saw a lamb in his vision, but when the seals were being opened, I think he probably saw Jesus as a man removing the seals. Will there actually be 4 horsemen galloping around the world? Something like that. Will they be galloping by your house one day and you'll know, uh-oh, time is here, you know? Well, no, I don't think they're actually literally 4 horsemen. Now, I have seen some movies and TV shows which show something, a horseman galloping around, and some people think that, but I don't think that's to be taken literally that way. It's just they're personifications of conquest and war and famine and death. They are only literal in the sense that there really will be conquest and war and famine and death on the earth. That's what the meaning is of all of that there. So Revelation is full of figurative language, and some of these symbols are obvious in their meaning. The dragon is the devil. The lake of fire is hell. The great white throne is the Lord's judgment seat. And in some cases, Revelation tells us the meaning of the symbols itself. It tells us what it means. The stars are angels, it says in chapter 1. We went over that. The lampstands are churches. The seals, the trumpets, the bowls are disasters. Incense is the prayers of the saints. And sometimes you can figure out what the symbols mean by looking at the Old Testament, because a lot of them come from out of the Old Testament. They are allusions to what is in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, we can find the tree of life, the rainbow, the morning star, the rod of iron. The 4 horsemen are there, actually, and the beast are there in Daniel. Now, admittedly, some symbols are not clear completely, but not very many. In some cases, it's hard to know if something should be taken literally or symbolically. For example, mountains can represent large nations. But is every mountain in Revelation a nation, or is it talking about a real mountain? Well, sometimes it's difficult to tell. In Revelation 17:9, it talks about the great harlot sitting on 7 mountains. Now, many people think those are real mountains because Rome was built on 7 mountains. And there's good reason to believe that the harlot is Rome. But in Revelation 6:16, the kings of the earth speak to the mountains and say, "Fall on us and hide us from the wrath of God." Now, those mountains might be nations, since kings are speaking to them. Kings don't often speak to mountains and ask for help. So maybe those are nations there. Same thing is true about stars. There are stars that might be real stars, and there are stars that might be angels. So discernment is needed about some of that. And some things can be hard to understand about Revelation. I like what Proverbs 25:2 says. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter. And you and I are like kings, and as we search it out, God will give us understanding. And one way that we can gain understanding is by reading and studying other viewpoints, even those we disagree with. And that's what I have tried to do. Because I have changed my views sometimes, and it's come from reading and studying other viewpoints, and I get ideas and things that I never thought about. And that's really how we are to learn in the body of Christ. And so it's always a good thing to learn from each other like that. Now, the opening of the seals is not the same as reading the scroll, so don't get confused there. The scroll cannot be read until all 7 of the seals have been removed and are open. But as each seal is removed, Satan knows his time is short. And so things seem to get a little bit worse as we go on. 1/3 or 1/4 to 1/3 to 1 whole being destroyed, because I think Satan realizes time is running short and he wants to do everything that he can. Okay, excuse me, verse 1, chapter 6. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." Now, one thing to note is that none of the 7 seals are described as being God's judgment or God's wrath being poured out on earth. Although that is a popular teaching about Revelation. That is what some teach, that this is the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls are God's judgment on the earth, God's wrath being poured out, and he's doing this hoping that people will repent. They never seem to repent, though, so I don't quite get that. But that is a view, but you don't see that here about the seals. It doesn't say that. Now, if the seals are not God's judgment, then what could they be? Well, I believe the seals are describing the consequences of human rule apart from God. In other words, what we see, the mess that we see in the world today, this isn't God's judgment on us. This is our sin. We've caused all the problems in the world. That's really what it is here. And so the first 4 seals are describing the disorder and the chaos that humans have made in the world throughout history. That's what I think. Now, in the 5th seal, people are asking God, how long before there is justice? They want God to judge. They don't think he's judged yet. They're saying, God, now is the time to judge. Do something here. The judgment has been delayed. And in the meantime, the human rulers remain in power. That's why we have the wars, disease, famine, and death in those first 4 seals. Now, our job during these first 4 seals is to spread the gospel throughout the world. That's what we are called to do. And this present world will not come to an end until the gospel goes to all the nations. And while Christians are spreading the gospel, a funny thing happens. Actually, I don't know that it's funny, but something happens. Some of them get martyred. So we're called to go out and do this. This is God's command to us. But in doing that, some of us are going to get martyred in doing that. That's what it says here. And that's why we see in the fifth seal, Christians are asking God, how long before we see your judgment? We're tired of this. Come and judge the world, do something. But they're told to wait until more believers have died. So I don't think God is responsible for what's going on in the world in the first four seals. I think it's the human political rulers, the nations of the world, that are responsible. And to back this up, Psalm 2, verse 2 says, "The kings of the earth and the rulers are against the Lord and his anointed." So from Old Testament times, the nations have been against God and his anointed and what he wants to do. They are rebelling against God because they are being influenced by the spirit of Antichrist. Now, in 1 John 4:3, it says, "You have heard the spirit of Antichrist is coming and is now already in the world." John is saying this isn't happening at some unknown time in the future. This is happening in his day. The spirit of Antichrist is already present in his day, he's saying. And by the way, probably John, who wrote that letter, also wrote the book of Revelation. Probably. Some people disagree, but I think I would tend to say that he wrote both. Now, 1 John 2:22, "Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? He is Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son." 2 John 7 says, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an Antichrist." Now, in the first century, all the Roman Caesars denied the Father and the Son. What do you think that makes them? An Antichrist. John said right there. Most political leaders in our world today deny the Father and the Son. What do you think that makes them? An Antichrist. So John says anyone who denies that Jesus is the Christ is a liar and an Antichrist. 1 John 2:18 says, "Little children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come, by which we know that it is the last hour." Many Antichrists have come, John says. So John believes there can be more than one Antichrist. He's not limited at all. His thinking is really broad when it comes to the Antichrist there. And I would say these are the rulers of nations. That's what they are. They're the rulers of the nations. And it doesn't mean that a single person necessarily is the Antichrist, but it means that at some point in time, I think almost every ruler can act as an Antichrist. I would say that about my country. The rulers, the president sometimes, I think, can do that. I would say that about other countries, that at times, because of that spirit of Antichrist influence, any ruler can act like an Antichrist. In fact, maybe that makes sense because I think Jesus, or God, is the one that decides when the Antichrist, if there is one Antichrist, will appear, and so Satan always has to be ready. He's got to have somebody waiting over here because he doesn't know when it's going to happen. So I think he's always has many Antichrists ready there. Now, Jesus warned us about people who would claim to be Christ. Now, Christ means anointed one. That's what it means. And so, do you know any leaders in the world that claim to be an anointed one? There are many leaders, I think, who would say, yeah, I'm an anointed one. God has put me here. Don't be fooled by them, is what Jesus is saying. The spirit of Antichrist is not on one particular political leader. It influences many leaders in many nations. The spirit of Antichrist works against God's will, And that's why some of these leaders could be considered a false Christ, even if they're not religious, because they're against Christ. So when the time is right, one of those false Christs will probably become the Antichrist. So the four horsemen don't represent only one ruler. I think they represent many rulers throughout history who are influenced by the spirit of Antichrist. Okay, verse 2. And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now, some people think this rider is Jesus because he's on a white horse. And they think, oh, white, Jesus, white is purity, this must be Jesus. And Jesus is mentioned in Revelation 19 as riding a white horse when he returns. But there are important differences between the two. They are each wearing a different type of crown. The rider here is wearing a crown of authority. When Jesus comes back in the Greek, his crown means a crown of victory, and he is the only one who ever wears a crown of victory. This rider has a bow, but in Revelation 19, Jesus has a sword. And it seems kind of odd that this first seal would be positive, and then the next three seals would be negative. It just seems like they would go more together if they're all negative in that sense. So I don't think this is Jesus here. I think the first seal is someone imitating Jesus. And that's why he's seen on a white horse. He's using deception to conquer nations. He is being politically aggressive. So the first rider has a bow, and a bow is a symbol of war. A bow is used to fight from a distance. But this bow doesn't have any arrows. You notice that. There's no arrows there. A bow without an arrow means he's privately threatening war. Maybe he's using diplomacy to try to get his way, but he's making some threats. Publicly, it seems like he's using peaceful means, but the threats are being made privately. Hitler did this before World War II. This is how he took over Austria and what used to be called Czechoslovakia. It was a peaceful conquest. Not a shot was fired. But behind the scenes, Hitler was making threats and say, you better let my troops go in there or else. And so they had no choice. The whole world knew what he was doing, but no one knew how to stop it. That gives you kind of an idea of what the Antichrist might do. It says a crown was given to him. A crown has to do with authority. The word given or granted is used 22 times in Revelation, quite often. In this case, I think the writer has the help of Satan when he does this. In Revelation 13:2, it says the dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and great authority. And it says he went out conquering and to conquer. He's trying to achieve world domination, and he is successful. Some nations will resist, but they will be taken care of by the second horseman. So, verses 3 and 4. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. Now, this writer is able to take peace from the earth. So the time for diplomacy, making threats is over. Now it's wartime. He's become stronger, more bolder. And taking peace means there's fewer safe places to live, which means there's more refugees, there's more illegal immigrants who want to leave from where they are and go to a safe place if they can find one. And this rider is given the sword. The other rider had a bow. A bow you fight from long distance. The sword you use close fighting, hand-to-hand combat. You can use the sword. And when it says there was given to him, it means God won't stop this, but it's not his will. God is going to allow it. God is allowing the evil in the nations to become hardened. And this is very similar to what we see in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh was allowed to do certain things to Israel. And the end result was that Pharaoh's heart became hardened. And part of the time in Exodus, it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The other times it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And what that means is God just kind of stood back and let Pharaoh continue to do what he wanted to do. And his heart became more and more hardened as he did that, till he was resistant of any kind of conviction of sin. So that's what I think is the meaning here, what God is doing and what's happening there in the world. The nations are becoming hardened, just like Pharaoh did. Now, this fiery red horse has to do with bloodshed, and it just happens that the dragon is also described that way, fiery red, in chapter 9 and chapter 12, which means the dragon is somehow connected to all of this here. And it says that people should kill one another. Well, this includes all kinds of war, on land, on air, on sea, and I think even nuclear war. In the first seal, it was not a world war. It was a bow with no arrows. It was a peaceful conquest. But this time, in the second seal, it's bloodshed. It's fighting. It's war going on. Verses 5 and 6. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hands. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." So John heard a voice in the midst of the living creatures. And this voice from heaven is needed to bring order. This is a good voice. God intervenes on behalf of mankind so things don't get worse than they already are. And when our lives seem out of order, we need to listen for that voice from the Lord, for that voice from heaven. It will be there when we need to hear it. We need to ask the Lord to speak. And the Lord here is acting as a restraining force so this situation doesn't get any worse than it already is. Next slide. And you can see some scales there. Those are actual scales, how they weighed things, measured things from that time period, what they looked like. It's a black horse, which has to do with sadness, pain, sorrow, depression, and the rider has a pair of scales he's holding there. And the scales are used to weigh food, and that tells us this is going to be an economic crisis. He's holding the scales in his hand, meaning he has some control over what goes on there. And the scales mean that food will have to be measured out. Some people might not get any. Some people might just get a little bit, not as much as they need. There's not enough food for everyone. So the economic crisis and famine are the natural resorts of war that had gone on before, the seal before. So it will be this kind of food crisis that brings about the mark of the beast in Revelation 13. Next slide. And there you can see the wheat and the barley. A denarius was 1 day's wages. A quart of wheat is enough food to feed one person for 1 day. And there would be no money left over for anything else. And wheat is good grain. Barley is inferior grain. It doesn't taste quite as well, and it's not as nutritious as wheat is. And you can buy 1 quart of wheat for 3 quarts of barley, which means that you could feed 3 persons with the barley. You can only feed 1 with the wheat. So only those who have a lot of money will be buying wheat, and most people will be settling for barley. Grain was the most popular food in the first century. So this is happening to the most popular food. Imagine if that happened to rice in Southeast Asia, that type of thing. And so as soon as war starts, there will be less food available, which means higher inflation. Inflation is a common problem caused by war. And the voice says, "Do not harm the oil and the wine." Well, people can't survive on olive oil and wine alone. Those are luxury items. And the wealthy, they can still afford those things, but the rich always seems to get what they want, but the poor will struggle to feed themselves and their families. Most Christians that John is talking to were poor at this time. Okay, the fourth seal, verses 7 and 8. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed him. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beast of the earth. Now, a pale horse is the color of death. So this is the natural outcome of what happens after war, after famine, economic problems. And in the Old Testament, Hades is called Sheol. So Hades is not hell. That's a popular misconception. Hades is not hell. Hell in Revelation is the lake of fire. We will see that in chapter 20. Hades is kind of like a temporary prison, and that's where you put all the bad guys until you decide what you're going to do with them, and that's basically what God is doing with Hades. So people die on earth, Hades comes along, scoops them up, puts them in this prison called Hades, and they remain there until the day of judgment. And then everyone is judged, and then Hades, there's no longer any need for it, so Hades is thrown into the lake of fire. And when believers die, then our spirit and soul go straight to be with the Lord. That's where we will be. Now it says they will kill 4 different ways. And these are also Old Testament judgments mentioned in Ezekiel 5 and Ezekiel 14. The sword is death by war, maybe execution. We saw that with the second seal. Hunger means people will starve to death from lack of food. We just saw that in the third seal. You can see how these are kind of repeating a little bit here. Death has to do with disease, with pestilence. COVID could be an example of that. Could also be violence in some of the cities, rioting going on, demonstrations, that type of thing. And then people will die from wild beasts. I mean, in our day and age, that's not a main way that people die. We don't think of that. But that was a way that people could die in the first century. In fact, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, Nero had Christians covered in wild beast skins and then torn to death by dogs. That's how he had some Christians killed. In the second century, some Christians were condemned to the beast. And that meant you would be exposed to a variety of wild animals in an arena. Leopards, lions, wild boars, maybe other animals, and you would have to fight for your life. And you didn't win very often. So that's what it means by the beast. And actually, there could be another meaning here. We know that in Revelation 13, there are 2 beasts that they're called. So maybe John is kind of hinting at these 2 beasts that are going to be coming, one from the sea, one from the land, because those 2 beasts are also going to kill a lot of Christians. So this writer is given power over a fourth of the earth, which means not every nation is affected. Then this power is given by Jesus, since he holds the keys of death and Hades. So things may seem out of control on earth, but actually God is in control. And the gospel is spreading during this time. And God's plan at this point is to harden the hearts of the nations and the Antichrist. Now, you will notice nothing bad seems to be happening to any of the 4 horsemen, whoever these represent. That will change in the 6th seal. Okay, the 5th seal. Verses 9 through 11, I saw under the altar the souls of the martyrs who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then a white robe was given to each of them, and they were told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were, was complete. So the 5th seal is about the martyrs. Now, some people have a tough time with this. If God is supposed to protect the church during the tribulation, why are there martyrs? Well, God does protect the church spiritually, not necessarily physically. Sometimes it's actually a good thing to die because people who see that may get saved. That's the downside to that. I hate to tell you, but maybe if one of you die, some people may get saved by that. But of course, none of us want to volunteer to be that person, right? But I think that's why God sometimes allows that. Christians are always protected from the wrath of God, but we're not always protected from the wrath of Satan. Now, the altar is where the sacrifices take place. Blood from the sacrifice would drip under the altar. And so these martyrs have offered themselves as a sacrifice to God. And they were killed for the word of God and the testimony they held. In other words, they died for preaching the gospel, and their testimony is that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar or any other kind of ruler. And so these martyrs were the ones who died during the 4 seals, throughout all history, I believe, since the time of Christ. And it's interesting here, the words, the number of, in verse 11, are not there in the Greek. Those words aren't there. They were supplied by the translators who were kind of helping out there. They thought it would be better to put that there. But it may mean that they wait until the character of the remaining martyrs on earth is perfected and complete. So it's character, the way that one lives, that makes a martyr, not the way that one dies. It's the way we live that really makes us become a martyr. All Christians should offer themselves as living sacrifices to God. That is our job to do. That is what Paul says we should do in Romans 12. And when we do that, it's really like we're preparing ourselves to be a martyr. That's what we're doing when we do that. We're willing to offer ourselves if the Lord should ask for our life. Now, some Christians are offended that there are martyrs at all. They really do not like that. And it will seem to them that God is not protecting them. But remember that Jesus said in Matthew 11:6, "Blessed is he who is not offended because of me." That's what he said. And so the martyrs cry out, "How long until we see justice?" Some of them are offended because God is delaying judgment and more die. Now someone might ask, why doesn't God just get rid of Satan right now? Why doesn't he just use the nuclear option on Satan, end this whole thing, get rid of him, then we can just all go on with life? I mean, we'd all like that. But there is a reason that God does not do that. If God removes Satan right now, Satan would say to him, if I had more time, I could do much more evil. I would have many more followers, and I could defeat you, God. You must be scared of me for getting rid of me this early. And so there is no way that God is going to give Satan any kind of excuse. And so Satan will do the very worst that he can do in the world. And God will allow that to happen. So when he does judge Satan, Satan will not have an excuse to give at all. God allows Satan to do his worst, and then the end will come. Verses 12 through 17. I looked when he opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? And the answer is nobody is able to stand. In verse 12, there's an earthquake and signs in the sky. And in the Old Testament, when the sun turns black and the moon becomes like blood and the stars are seen falling from heaven, it's a way of speaking about what we would call earth-shattering events. In other words, it's symbolism that is being used. Now, some people do want to take it literally. I don't think it is to be taken literally in this case. I just think it means there's going to be an earth-shaking event that takes place. Not where the sun actually goes black. If the sun actually went black, there would be no heat. It would get very cold and nothing could survive. So I think this, again, is talking about symbolism here. So this is something like 9/11 or the fall of the Berlin Wall or the closing down of nations because of COVID. It's something major and important worldwide that's happening. And so the opening of the sixth seal is a time of huge political and social upheaval and conflict. It's a dark time spiritually. That's why the sun is dark. It says, the stars of heaven fell. And the word star can refer to any object in the sky, planets, comets, meteors, asteroids. Those who take this literally say that this may be a meteor or an asteroid that falls on the earth and does great damage. But we've also seen that stars mentioned in Revelation 1:20 are angels. So it's possible this could be referring to a shaking in the heavenly places, a spiritual shaking. Revelation 12:9 says stars are fallen angels who were cast down to earth. So this verse could be referring to what happens in Revelation 12:9. Then verse 14 says, then the sky receded as a scroll when rolled up. It will look like a window opening up in heaven. It may look like the sky has disappeared. So this verse is a partial fulfillment of Isaiah 34:4. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved. All the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their host shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine and as fruit falling from a fig tree. Verse 14 says, every mountain and island was moved out of its place. An earthquake can move mountains, and it can move even islands. Island of Japan was moved when they had their earthquake in 2011. Isaiah 64:1 says, oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down, that the mountains might shake at your presence. And so John is using these images from Isaiah to describe what the end of history will look like. Verse 15 lists several groups of important people. Kings, I think these are like prime ministers and presidents. Great men, these might be senior leaders in government. Rich men, these are the businessmen, the billionaires, the Bill Gates, people like that. Military commanders, these are generals. Mighty men, maybe strong leaders such as governors and mayors. And then every slave and free man, which is the majority of people. And they all have one thing in common, great and small. They are trying to hide from God. They do not want to face God. And they all run in panic because they know the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? No one will be able to stand. Every knee will bow before Jesus at that time. And so this is the answer to the prayers of the saints back in verse 10. How long, O Lord? Now it's going to happen. Now there will be justice. God is finally going to judge. When it says the great day of his wrath has come, it's referring to the final judgment in Revelation 20 when unbelievers will stand before God. They said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. There is nowhere to hide. This passage in Revelation is talking about the end of history. People are trying to hide from the Lord. They don't want to face him. Now, if you go back to the beginning of history in Genesis 3, what did Adam and Eve do after they disobeyed God? They hid from the Lord. They did not want to face him. Adam was aware of his disobedience. He felt shame, and he was afraid of facing the Lord. And that's exactly what is happening at the end of history again. And that's what has been happening all throughout history. Humans have been hiding from God, not wanting to face him. So let me ask you a question. Are you tempted to run from God in fear or run to him in faith? Those are the two choices that we are given. We can run from him in fear. We can run to him in faith. Let me go ahead and just end in prayer here. Father, we thank you, Lord, for your goodness. And Lord, we pray that you would help us to be faithful Christians to what you have called us to do. Help us, Lord, not to hold on to our comforts, not to hold on to our treasures in this world, but to release them to you and to offer ourselves, Lord, as a living sacrifice to you that you can use when you so desire, Lord. That is our hope, Lord, that we can become living sacrifices for you, Jesus. And all of God's people said, amen.